Hello, everybody. Very interesting piece recently in, of all things, the New York Post. Never much cared for that newspaper. Didn't seem to be particularly profound, but it has a intellectually heavy-hitting piece from an intellectual heavy hitter. Charles Murray has a piece out, an opinion piece, which is entitled, "As We Grow Out of Intellectual Adolescence, Religion's popularity soars," and this soaring of religion, he thinks, is significant. He believes, or he argues at least in the piece, he says he has a theory. We, I guess the people of the West, or at least of the United States, are emerging from the West's intellectual adolescence. And this is taken, I think, in some ways from a new book that Charles Murray has out. It's called Taking Religious Seriously, and I'm thrilled that Charles Murray is joining us from his home in Burkittsville, Maryland, in the middle of the bucolic, is it the Virginia? No, it's the Maryland countryside, Charles. Right. I was going to say Virginian countryside, but I even have an image of it from your X page, and it looks beautiful. I'm very envious. So, Charles, are you really serious here, or are you trying to annoy atheists that your theory, we are emerging from the West's intellectual adolescence? What exactly does that mean?
Well, the analogy comes from the tendency of adolescents to think that their parents were wrong about everything. And that's pretty much the situation of intellectuals in the 20th century. Late 19th century through the 20th century, that there had been a series of body blows to traditional religious belief during the Enlightenment, genuine body blows. There are a variety of things that had been believed before that you couldn't believe after geology and astronomy and biology made a variety of advances, evolution being chief among them, but also Freudian psychology, for example, that pretty much gave an alternative to thinking in terms of sin. And so in the 20th century, intellectuals, and I'm referring specifically to that class, were such that religion simply became something that smart people didn't believe anymore. And that's the message I got. I went to Harvard, this will date me, but I went to Harvard in the fall of 1961. And it wasn't that I took religion courses that disabused me. It was that I didn't study religion. My professors weren't religious. The friends of mine, none of them were religious. And the zeitgeist was smart people don't believe that stuff anymore. And that was that way pretty much for the next 20 years. Anyway, what I think is happening in the 21st century, a variety of things, among them a variety of empirical things that are causing people to take a new look. But also, I think that there is some sense that at the beginning of the Enlightenment, we cut ourselves off from a very rich body of wisdom about the human condition and what it means to live a human life. And we're reacquiring it. And we no longer think our parents were wrong about everything. I think that's...
Do you have any kids, Charles? I wonder if this is... if I put my Freudian cap on, I don't know if Freud wore a cap. If we get you on that settee, I'm sure you've got a Freudian sofa somewhere in your beautiful home. Is this somehow a Charles Murray narrative? Did you rebel against your parents when you went to Harvard in 61?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you go from a small town in Iowa to Harvard, you clearly have a desire to get out of Dodge and go to the bright lights in the big city, which I did. I didn't have any hostility toward my parents.
Were your parents religious? Did you lecture them on your atheist wisdom? Or
I was actually raised Presbyterian, but in my sophomore year, when I came back to Newton for Christmas, we were going to Presbyterian services on Sunday, and my dad was at the wheel. And you know, Andrew, the word sophomoric does exist for a reason. And I announced that I no longer believed in all this stuff. And my father shocked me by saying, "Well, neither do I." And I said, "Well, why have you been driving?"
So this was your, so to speak, come to Jesus moment with your father.
Yeah. And I said, why have you been dragging us to church all these years? And he said it was a good discipline. It was a way to remind you of your obligations to others and to fulfill your responsibilities. So I was thought I was rebelling, but I really wasn't.
What about your own kids?
They are not religious. They are not, none of us, including me, has ever been an atheist. I am among those who think of all the plausible explanations for the universe that simple atheism is the least plausible. So I've never been hostile toward religion, and always thought that it had a lot of social value. But this book is not about the utility of religion. It's about seeking out the truth value in religion, which is a long, tedious process.
And the T word, Charles, that's a bit of an Enlightenment word, isn't it? I mean, most serious religious thinkers, I don't know, from Augustine to Aquinas, they weren't very interested in the word truth, were they? I mean, it was a rather tricky, slippery word.
Why do you say that? What makes you think that Augustine and Aquinas were anything but devoted?
Well, they were traumatized by the word truth, the T word, truth. It was a word that they moved towards or tried to move towards, but it wasn't self-evident, was it?
Well, there, I think you know more about Aquinas and Augustine than I do.
Yeah, so now you're embarrassing me. I know nothing about those guys. So let's get back to the Enlightenment. Okay. Who are the people who are most to blame? If you're going to spank these supposed Enlightenment thinkers, who are they? Is it Voltaire?
No, I think it is what William James referred to as scientism that took hold in the 19th century, which is, instead of being a really useful tool, reason and empiricism, instead of being a really useful tool for inquiring into the way the world works, it became the only legitimate tool. And so if you were inquiring into things that smacked of the supernatural, the reaction of scientists in the 19th century basically was the same as the reactions of fundamentalist Christians when someone tries to question their beliefs.
But aren't you you may be right about what you call the scientism of the 19th century, but aren't you misrepresenting the Enlightenment? I mean, the Enlightenment was, firstly, it was of the 18th century, even the late 17th century, and it was made up of very serious thinkers from, I don't know, from Locke to Hume to many others, who all recognized the issues here, who weren't prone to what you call scientism, of replacing God with science.
Isn't it the old story of something that starts out virtually all good, because I think the Enlightenment was a wonderful thing, still do, and then over the course of time, the true believers, and that's the right way to describe a lot of the scientists in the 19th century, the true believers become way too dogmatic and too closed off to new ideas. And I'm taking my cue here from William James, who in the late 19th century attacked scientism, and for precisely this reason. They were not following the rules in terms of the way originally reason and evidence were supposed to work. They were ignoring evidence that they didn't want to deal with.
And of course, the two characters who were most named in this narrative in the 19th century, at least, are Marx and Freud. How central are they in your narrative in taking religion seriously, or a little bit more seriously? Marx, of course, famously described religion as an opium of the people, and Freud had his own particular take on why we're religious and how we get perhaps beyond that.
The whole issue of the Enlightenment that we've been talking about takes up about a page and a half in the book. So I'm just trying at that point to put in a little background. And the piece in the New York Post I was asked if I wanted to submit a piece that would drew from the book. And I had this idea of taking the adolescence analogy. And to tell you the truth, when I wrote it, I wasn't at all sure the New York Post would be interested in running it. They ran it unchanged, but it's not a central theme of the book.
Coming back to the Post, and then we'll leave it. You note that, and I think this is an interesting observation, Charles, and I see it a lot on the show, that we're at a moment where 20 years ago, the Dawkins and the Dennetts, and particularly the Hitchens of the world, were dominant, and their arguments against God were very popular. 25 years later, everything's changed. Maybe it's not Charles Murray who's taking religion seriously, or you're not the only one who's taking it seriously. In fact, you note that there are many others. You name them. Some of them are controversial figures like Peter Thiel, Jordan Peterson. Others are perhaps more mainstream, like Ross Douthat, E.J. Dionne, Andrew Sullivan. So something shifted in the zeitgeist, Charles. Are we now in a world where being or taking religion seriously is more of an orthodoxy, a mainstream intellectual orthodoxy?
Yeah, it was kind of bothering me when I was working on the book that other things were coming out that was going to make me look like I was following the crowd, and I've never followed the crowd intellectually in my life. But I take refuge in the fact that, doggone it, I was thinking about this stuff 20 years ago. This is not something that I've acquired in the last few years. What's going on right now? It's an odd contrast, because if you look at the percentage of people attending religious services and the percentages of people who say they have no religion, those numbers continue to increase. It seems to be focused among an intellectual class. And I'm saying it as this is kind of self-serving, because obviously I joined this. I think that there was a kind of shallowness that finally struck home to a lot of people, that the intellectual conventional wisdom was increasingly sterile, and that accessing religion, taking it seriously, was, and now I'm speaking personally. Okay, give me a second. This will take a minute to explain. I am convinced that sensitivity to spiritual issues is a trait, and it's not unlike ability to appreciate music. It's not unlike the ability to appreciate great art. That it's a continuum from low to high that people have, probably genetically grounded, in the same way that the ability to, well, intellectual ability is genetically grounded.
But you can be awed, Charles, by the view out of your backyard, or by Bach, who you refer to in your New York Post piece, or by Rembrandt, or by Mozart, or by anyone else, without being religious, can't you?
Odd is one thing. Do some people hear music differently from me? Which is, they are moved by it. They enter into all of the elements of it in a way I don't. Yeah, I've had friends that way. I had a professional violist friend who heard music completely different from the way I do. I go to a museum and I look at great paintings, and I can make myself appreciate the technique and say, well, this is nice. And I spend about 15 seconds on a painting and I walk on. And I know people who can spend half an hour in front of that and be thinking all the time and experiencing things I don't experience. And Andrew, what I'm saying is the same is true of spirituality. And I will use me and my wife. My wife has access to spiritual insight that I do not, and I never will. So when I watched her progressing on her exploration, I couldn't follow her in many ways, because she's smarter than I am in matters of spirituality. What I could do was deploy other assets I have to take on issues that I can enter into, mostly empirically grounded, which to her are kind of beside the point, but for me is the best I can do.
What's smartness got to do with religion?
I shouldn't have used the word
You've
smart.
mentioned it several times in this conversation. You've already noted that you went to Harvard, which is supposedly for smart people, maybe not so much anymore. You said that your wife is smarter than you.
Yeah.
Again, coming back to many religious thinkers, intelligence and belief are viewed quite differently. Again, going back to Augustine, he was very suspicious of intelligence, both within himself and in others, in terms of understanding God. So do you think that people who go to Harvard, they're supposed to be intelligent? I wonder sometimes, especially some of the people who come on my show have been to Harvard. Do you think that there should be a connection between being intelligent and being religious?
I think there's a correlation of about 0.2, which is a very low correlation. Look, you have people, first place, I was using the word smart initially to refer to the ordinary understanding of intelligence. And I shouldn't have used it with regard to spirituality. But the fact is that there are lots of highly intelligent people who can appreciate great music. There are lots of highly intelligent people who have the same problem that I have with appreciating great art. And there are highly intelligent people who think Shakespeare is boring. So whereas there is maybe a modest relationship, these traits have they have a great deal of independence. And in the case of spirituality, I think that both Christopher Hitchens, who was a famous atheist, and Francis Collins, the physicist who wrote the book called The Language of God, is very religious. They're both real smart in the IQ sense, but they come out in completely different places in matters of religion.
Are you envious, or were you envious of your wife? Is that one of the reasons
Yes.
you pursued this and wrote this book?
I was watching her enrich her life in ways that I wanted mine to be enriched, and I was having trouble keeping up. Yeah, so I was envious of her in that regard. But I was
could one argue, Charles, you've already mentioned this adolescent element. Could one argue that you're having a late adolescent crisis?
No. I think that if I had had a road to Damascus moment and flipped in a matter of a week or two, then you could make that argument. In a way, I parallel my wife in this regard. She said one time, because she had a very gradual change. She started out in Quakerism because, well, let me tell you how she started out. Our baby was born, our first child, in 1985, and she found that she loved the baby in her memorable phrase, more than evolution required. And she felt that this superfluous love.
I bet she went to Harvard too. Sounds like a Harvard kind of statement.
Yeah, she had to make do with Yale PhD.
Oh dear.
And Oxford and
Oh,
Yale PhD. Okay, we're too overeducated, but never mind that. She felt that she was a conduit for a love that was very mysterious and just pointed vaguely toward God, and that's what set her off on her quest. But she went to some mainline Protestant churches initially, and she could not in good conscience recite the Apostles' Creed along with the rest of the congregation. So she ended up with Quakerism, which is very non-doctrinaire. I don't know where I started with that, but anyway, that's how she did it.
Well, let's reverse the title of the book, Taking Religion Seriously. Does Charles Murray's wife take the religious Charles Murray seriously?
What a good question. She wishes that I were not as interested in questions of historicity and other empirical issues, because she does think they're beside the point, that what is rich for her is the way in which religion provides insight to her into the human condition. and into her life and into the meaning of living a good life. And she rightly suspects that I do not have the same sensitivity to that. I will add, the reason I got off on describing how she got started is for her, her faith has very slowly evolved. She says, like a light that's on a rheostat, that gradually gets brighter. And that's analogous to mine. My faith, such as it is, has been an evolving thing that started in the late 1990s.
You're certainly onto something in historical terms. You wrote an interesting piece for the Wall Street Journal, Can Science Reckon with the Human Soul? And I know a lot of the book focuses on this. We did a show a couple of months ago with a couple of French writers who have a new book out. It's done very, very well in Europe. I'm not sure you're familiar with it. God, the Science, the Evidence, by a couple of French technologists. Actually, one is an entrepreneur, Olivier Bonacieux. I think you'd be interested in the book. We also did a show with Alexander Bathany, a Hungarian thinker on hospices and near-death experiences that I know you're interested in. So are you, though, in your own way, Charles, flirting with the very scientism that you're critical of in the 19th century? You're looking to science of one kind or another, whether it's Bathany's or the guys in France. You may not be familiar with their work. They certainly, I think, fall into this trap of using science, of relying on science to prove the existence of God.
In one sense, guilty as charged. I don't have leaps of faith. And sometimes I think leaps of faith are probably necessary. Let me offer you an alternative way of thinking about it. That the relationship of science to religion has flipped over the last century. So that starting around 1500, you had science steadily explain things, correctly explain things, that religion had previously said were evidence of God. And whether this was things like thunderstorms and earthquakes, or whether they were things like where human beings came from, the story of Adam and Eve versus evolution, the story of fallen man versus Freud, that I'm not saying Freud, I don't want to associate the word correct with any looseness. But you had a lot of scientific findings that were body blows to religious belief. And it was assumed at the time that the remaining elements would eventually be explained as well. That all we had left was the God of the gaps. And religion was stuck with things that science had not yet explained. And in the 20th century, beginning with the Big Bang, or the establishment of the Big Bang theory, you had a series of scientific developments which science discovered new problems and new unknowns for which it had no answers yet, but religion did. And so if I had to use a historical analogy, I'd say, maybe I use this in the New York Post article. We're in the same place that the Michelson-Morley experiment put physics. That the speed of light did not behave as Newton's laws said it should, and that anomaly had to be explained, which Einstein did. But we are now in a situation where there are real challenges to materialism that need to be explained. They aren't fully, you can't go directly to the human soul as an explanation. That's an alternative, but they have to be dealt with.
One of the things that I struggle with is maybe taking religion seriously, not so much taking religion seriously, but God. You may be able to take religion seriously, but even these near-death experiences that have, maybe from a scientific point of view, some mystical or metaphysical meaning or truth that we hadn't quite realized, do they actually prove the existence of God, Charles? They may just prove some other weird scientific reality, as you say, a post-Einsteinian world where what we take for granted in logical terms is actually the reverse.
let's take an intermediate step as opposed to proving the existence of God. Let's suppose we phrase it in terms of the materialist assumption that uh, consciousness exists exclusively in the brain. The brain stops, consciousness stops. Something I believed for years and years and years. And the reason I believed it seemed to me to be extremely simple. Obviously, obviously, it's all in the brain.
Because you
Obviously,
went to Harvard, right? That's what they taught you there.
that's right. That's right. And so I took it for granted. And of course, the fact was, if I'd stepped back, I would say before about 1700, hardly anybody believed anything except that consciousness did not exist exclusively in the physical body, but rather that human beings had souls. That was the universal belief. And we went from that being the default assumption to materialism being the default assumption. Again, we meaning intellectuals. And so let's not say, do near death experiences prove that God exists or terminal lucidity, but rather, do they provide compelling evidence that information can be acquired and transmitted independently of the brain? And I think that's true. Let's go with near death experiences as an example. No, we cannot verify the reports that people go through a long tunnel with a brilliant light at the end and there is a being there that represents perfect love. Can't verify that. What we can do in some extreme cases is say, we have a person who we know medically had no respiration, no pulse, no brain waves, and we also know that while this person was in this condition, someone dropped a defibrillator on his foot. And later, when the guy comes back, he says, by the way, why did they drop that defibrillator on my foot? Or why is it that someone knew where his dentures were? Because while he was completely dead, his dentures had been put in a particular drawer in the operating room by a nurse. So these are things where you have clinical death, and you also have the acquisition of information by some other means.
Why do we want miracles, Charles? Why we humans love miracles so much? It always seems to me this God, the science, the evidence suggests that miracles can be somehow ground in science. You seem to be suggesting in that anecdote that there's some sort of scientific foundation for miracles. Is that a human thing? Or
wait a minute, Andrew,
that maybe there's something beyond it?
Andrew, you're the one that's saying the idea of humans having souls must be a miracle, whereas that's not necessary to attach that. If the loaves and fishes, yeah, that has to be a miracle. But the existence of a soul, one can imagine secular belief systems that can tolerate that. Well, for example, Buddhism is not technically a religion. And Buddhism takes the human soul as the existence as a central part of its beliefs. So I don't think you should be calling that a miracle.
When we talk about taking religion seriously, we had a couple of weeks ago Reza Aslan, a scholar of Islam, on the show, Los Angeles based, and he suggested his 2005 book, No God But God, was a huge bestseller, and it's being reissued now. He argues that all religions are absurd because we are absurd. In other words, they simply reflect us. And that's why, I guess in his words, we should take religion seriously, because we should take ourselves seriously. Is religion for you then a mirror, a kind of humanity? And would you agree with, I'm sure you know some of his work, Aslan, that religions are absurd because we're absurd, which makes them interesting?
What I think is that he has never met enough of the kind of people that I have encountered ever since I have been hanging out with my wife as she has been engaged in this. Andrew, I have been around people who I respect their intellects, I respect their mental stability, I respect their lack of self-delusion, who discuss these things, and it's as if I'm listening to a pure mathematician discuss mathematical theories that I'm completely incapable of understanding. I can tell they know what they're talking about. They're reflecting real experiences. And I'm confident that these people who are talking about religious experiences are talking about something they know something about and that I don't. So I think to dismiss religion as absurd means you haven't been around enough highly religious people. Some of them are really jaw dropping in terms of their impressiveness.
Couldn't you say the same about people who believe in cryptocurrency or AI or some other cult? I mean, there are smart people always who are either leaders or founders of cults or participants in them. What's the deal? I mean, just because they believe doesn't make them right.
No, but I just don't think that believing in cryptocurrency falls in the same level of a human experience as believing in God does. I think that one is trivial compared to the other. And that
I bet you don't own any cryptocurrency, Charles, do you?
No, I don't. But on the other hand, I don't have any discretionary income, period. So the point I'm trying to make here is that by all the ordinary standards through which I judge the reality of things I am exposed to, the reality of spiritual insight among certain religious people falls in that category. I am listening to people discuss something real. And I could call upon empirical indicators of this, I think, in a variety of ways. The many evidences of greater mental health and so forth. But those are indirect indicators of something that there is you can have more direct access to if you just hang out with more seriously religious people.
You argue in the book that God needs to find a way to reach overeducated agnostics. And I guess that's yourself. Was this a liberating intellectual exercise, Charles, to write about something that you don't know about? You're a scholar, a very controversial one, but you've written a lot about stuff that you at least claim to know a lot about. Have you ever written a book about something you almost acknowledge and embrace that you don't know much about? So is there something enlightening about using that word, enlightening or liberating, about that experience?
It's first place, this was more fun than anything I can recall writing for a long time. Just fun in an intellectual sense. And also, it turned out I'd rather enjoy writing a personal book where I don't have to keep myself absent from the narrative. And the reason I shouldn't keep myself absent is because of something I say explicitly in the first couple of chapters. People who are not religious, who are taking it seriously, have to come to grips with the fact that they are amateurs in some of the topics that they're going to have to make judgments about. So when I talk about the Big Bang, there's no way that I can claim to know what I'm talking about with regard to the physics of the Big Bang beyond what I've read, and that's a superficial knowledge. The same is true of near-death experiences. The same is true of terminal lucidity. The same thing is true of biblical scholarship. In all of these cases, I am working hard. I'm reading. I'm doing my homework. I'm doing my best to understand. But it is an intrinsic part of beginning to take religion seriously that you have to cut yourself loose from things you have confidence in. So you want to engage me in a conversation about IQ tests? I know what I'm talking about. I'm not worried about anything you can bring up. I can make statements to you, and I'm absolutely sure I'm right. And if I'm disagreeing with you, you're wrong. In the case of religion, so that when you brought up Augustine and Aquinas and their attitudes toward truth, I had to say to myself, I don't know. I don't know much about that.
Although you've just written a book on they're probably the two, certainly Augustine is probably the most important Christian thinker. You didn't read Augustine for this book?
I have read Augustine. I've read Thomas Aquinas. I'm not an expert on them.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up IQ tests. Of course, a lot of people associate you with a controversial take on IQ tests. So,
Well,
as
good,
you say
yeah.
on your X page, you may be a Madisonian or maybe a right-wing ideologue, pseudoscientist. You're most famously associated with the book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. Very controversial book. Don't need me to tell you that, Charles. What would happen if you died and God was some sort of product of affirmative action? If God ended up in the middle of the bell curve or towards the end of it, I mean, would you expect God to be at the top of the bell curve?
No, there's a section in the first chapter that one of my first steps was to realize that one must not anthropomorphize God. And the analogy I use, and by the way, I'm against, on theological terms, the Sistine Chapel ceiling that depicts God as a kindly old man with a flowing beard touching Adam's finger, because God is not a he. I have the same relationship to God that my obstreperous dog has to me. The dog knows who I am in some sense, knows certain things about me. The dog has absolutely no idea of what I'm doing when I'm sitting in front of my computer screen. My dog has no idea.
So you think. You never know. Some dogs are more intelligent than others.
I've had very intelligent dogs that still don't know anything. There is no way, if any God worthy of the name is as unknowable to me as I am to my dog. And that well, let me just give you an example. Try to imagine a being that exists outside of time. It's really hard to get your head around that. And the idea of the God of Christianity, or of other religions too, who is kind of everywhere. One of the famous Quaker expressions is there is that of God in everyone. And by that, they don't mean there's some good in everyone. They mean that in some sense, God is present in you. And so all of this makes me not think of God as being anywhere on the IQ bell curve.
Yeah, I have to admit, you're mystifying God. You're making him or she or it or whatever it is sound rather boring. What about the moral quality, Charles? I mean, most people, when they're religious, think of the Last Judgment and how to behave and who to be moral with. Where's that in your argument in taking religious seriously? I mean, you've got all this science stuff about maybe he's for real, or maybe it's for real, maybe it isn't. But what about morality?
You haven't hung out with enough religious people. You haven't had enough scotch with them over late at night.
Well, you've got your own. You've got your own particular. You've got your own wife. I've spent a long time with certain types of religious people who talk endlessly about the good. Where's the good in your argument?
Oh, that's different. You were talking about worrying about Judgment Day and so forth. And most of the religious people I know don't spend any time talking about that at all. They do talk about the good. They do talk about what the meaning of the good may be. They talk about, to me, the most provocative thing, given what first got my wife on the road, the love for her baby, the notion that God is love. And that's something that, by the way, the word love there is best used the Greek agape. I'm not talking about erotic love or friendship or so forth, but agape, which refers to a kind of a more broader benevolence that is to be extended universally, and that does not put you at the center of things. And it's a much more nuanced, difficult kind of love to understand. To me and to a lot of other religious people, I think that that's at the core of what makes religion attractive. That we're wrestling here with a God of love and how that has meaning for our lives. And worrying about whether we're going to heaven or hell comes way later.
Okay, so I'll take your point. So how should we behave? I mean, in terms of taking religion seriously, I accept, or let's say we accept your premise that we should take it seriously. What does it tell us about how to live in an America where there's a great deal of hatred of one kind or another against immigrants, against wealthy people, against poor people, against white people, against black people? What does your book tell us, taking religion seriously, about how, Charles, to live the good life?
Well, in the first place, hate should have no role in it. And on the contrary, the Jesus's injunction to love thine enemy would be taken a lot more seriously. That you literally need to do that, and that all of your interactions with people of all kinds must start from that premise. And another thing that your life should have at its core is that you are not at the center of it, that the ways in which you can help make happier, take away pain from those around you is a central part of living a good human life.
Are there models for that? I mean, I'm sure you know Peter Wehner. He's an old friend of mine, another one of your think tank people in DC. He's written extensively about awe. Are there individuals for you who sort of represent that? Wehner, John Rauch, others are very critical, yes, for example, of the evangelical movement in America that in there, I don't want to put words into their mouth, but they basically seem to be arguing that that these movements are full of hate rather than love. So are you as critical of the evangelicals, as the right-wing evangelicals, as guys like Rauch and Wehner? And do you see a model for how religious people should behave in America in 2025?
It so happens you picked the guy who introduced me to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, Pete Wehner, an old friend, and Jonathan is also an old friend, and that Pete has not stopped being an evangelical. He is being fiercely critical of his fellow evangelicals who are behaving this way. And I could also point you to another number of other prominent evangelical pastors who are doing the same thing. There is within the evangelical movement a core that says are evangelicals who are betraying everything we're supposed to stand for. And they're right. They are betraying everything.
And would you agree with John Rauch? His last book suggested that we should take religion seriously, maybe not because of its metaphysical qualities, because that actually strengthens democracy?
Oh, that you didn't need to persuade me of. I believed that for a long time. So did all the founding fathers. They said, look, if you're going to have a free society with a limited government, then people must be governing themselves, literally, their own individuals, and that religion is absolutely indispensable to that. So the utilitarian value of religion I've never doubted that. So in that sense, Jonathan's book is just fine, but I'm sort of left that behind in terms of my own interests.
Finally, Charles, you are, as I said, you're a controversial fellow. The bell curve created a great deal of ill will. Some people agree with it, but a lot of people strongly disagree. They think in some ways some of these arguments about intelligence and class structure in American life are bad. Could one perhaps suspect that there's a little bit of guilt in Charles Murray's taking religious seriously? He's starting to get nervous about how you're going to get judged?
No, not the slightest. I am not only proud of the bell curve, I think that the bell curve contains the germ of a lot of the arguments I've been making to you today.
Well, that's good stuff, Charles. Congratulations on the new book. taking religion seriously, Charles Murray, we certainly should take Charles Murray seriously. And if he's taking religion seriously, then maybe we should too. Real honor to have you on the show, Charles. We'll get you back. Maybe we'll do a bell curve show to create a little bit more controversy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.